jobs you can get in the country, and it's up for grabs later this year. I speak of being the mayor for London, and the man sat opposite me who's thrown his hat into the ring not that long ago was running for the leadership of the Conservative Party, and he got off to a good start, but it wasn't to be. So how will he fare this time when later this year Rory Stewart, as independent candidate, puts himself forward to be the elected mayor of London? Good to see you, Mr. Stewart. Thank you for coming by the studio. I think it was in November that we last met, so that's 2 or 3 months with a holiday in between. What have you learnt about London? What have you learnt about the job since I last saw you?
Well, thank you. I've been spending an enormous amount of time with police officers and with communities, so a lot of time with younger people in areas like Lambeth, but also a lot of time walking with serving and retired police officers on the beat. And I think it's that's been the most interesting thing for me, seeing the amazing job the Metropolitan Police is doing on the front line, but also seeing all the opportunities where if we get the investment right, we can actually make London safer.
How?
Main thing is getting people back in the neighbourhoods. We need to triple the number of uniformed officers on the beat, and we need to have the right training and support behind them, and we need the right technology and data to make sure they're in the right places at the right time. And it works. It's a formula that works. It's a formula, for example, that John Stevens did very successfully when he was in Northumberland and London, and we can bring the same approach back to London.
Lord Stevens, who was Commissioner of the Met, talked about hard-edged policing, as he calls it. What do you take that to mean? I'm going to have to throw the words at you. Stop and search, Mr. Stewart?
I think stop and search, absolutely. The question is how you do it, but very important part of the police arsenal. John Stevens, I think, was on your show earlier today.
He was.
And I think his way of thinking about policing is the right way of thinking about it. He very much led from the front. Famously, he was there at 2:33 in the morning, having breakfast with police officers. He made a real business of getting out on the beat. And one of the inspirations I've taken from him is that if I'm lucky enough to be mayor, I would like to train as a special constable and have the opportunity to be out with the officers on the beat. I think it's very difficult to get a sense of how to do this. This is what I learnt as prison officer, where I shadowed prison officers on the landings, unless you're with the men and women on the front line.
So just to clarify, I know you say when, I have to say were you to be successful, as well as the considerable duties of being the mayor, you will take on the responsibility of being what's called a special.
I'd love to do that. And
what do you think that will give you? What can you give back to London?
Well, I think the first thing is learning and just being out there. It's very difficult to get a sense of a job unless you actually see how the shift patterns work, unless you get a sense of what a police officer has to deal with every day, which is the combination of extreme emergencies, rushing off to a response, and then the daily business of developing relationship with the communities. And as I said, it's the lesson I really took when I took on the job of trying to reduce violence in prisons. One of the first things I did there was to do shifts with officers on the landings at Wormwood Scrubs to get a sense of the difficulties of their everyday life. And once you can see that, you can begin with working with them to try to solve issues like safety and violence.
Coming to calls in a moment, just finally, what I'm hearing from you, and I'm sure you're the first to admit there are many other issues, key issues that confront London, not least air quality, investment, post-Brexit, economic security, but I'm hearing crime then is very much what you're going to, not necessarily major on, but what you're going to first. Is that fair?
Absolutely. It's the number one priority. A city must be safe. Londoners deserve to be safe, and that's everybody. That's doing a thing called London Speaks, where we're taking teams. We've got about 6,000 volunteers now knocking on doors. And it doesn't matter whether I'm dealing with communities in Lambeth, where I met a mother whose son had been killed on the way back from getting the Sunday lunch, to seeing residents in more leafier suburbs of London who are also very worried, who are experiencing knife crime, whose children are worried. So we need to make the city safe for everybody, for mothers, for businesses, and unless the city's safe, it can't flourish. And the key thing to this, and this is again my lesson to reducing violence in prisons, is it's about energy and action. There's a lot of talk, a lot of strategies, but it's about getting on with it and getting behind the people who know what they're doing.
Let's get the calls through. Luke is in Beckenham, perhaps one of the leafier suburbs that Mr. Stewart just alluded to. Morning, Luke.
Good morning, Nick, and good morning, Rory. How are we doing? Just a quick question, Rory. If you were elected as mayor, what would you do to ensure that people got caught with guns or knives served an appropriate sentence rather than slipping through the net? Because it should be a mandatory sentence, in my opinion.
OK, just to check that everyone, I don't know, what would Rory Stewart do were he mayor as regards sentencing for those caught carrying knives or guns? Luke, stay on the line, Mr. Stewart.
Well, firstly, it's very important that we follow through on what the law is. The law says that there is meant to be a mandatory sentence if you're caught in possession, and sadly, far too many people who are caught in possession are not given that mandatory sentence. So we need to get that as a very important thing. People need to understand, and this is how we got on top of gun crime. We had a major problem with people carrying handguns in London, and it was the tough sentencing was one of the very important things that convinced criminals to stop doing that. So we need to make it clear to all people, young people, older people, that you should not be carrying a knife. It's not an excuse to say you're carrying it to defend yourself. It's a very dangerous thing. It's threatening the public, and we need to be clear that we're going to sentence people who do that.
But can you talk to the judiciary, Mr. Stewart? It's all very well saying that, and I appreciate in this country we have a system where it is divorced, and that has many benefits. But you don't have the power, say, of the New York mayor, where you can get the district attorneys in, do you? You don't enjoy that in London, were you to be mayor?
Yeah, the power of the London mayor. The London mayor is more powerful than the mayor of New York in many ways, but the real power of the London mayor is in relation to the policing. So it's about catching people, but the judiciary is independent. But we need to work with the judiciary. We need to talk to them. Why is it that too many people are not getting these sentences? Can we improve the evidence that we present? Is there some issue around the law that we need to address through primary legislation? Why is it that magistrates and judges are not giving those sentences? Because we've got to pass the message that carrying a knife is a lethal thing, and that the level of homicides with knives are at a really shocking level in this country. Some of the figures recently suggested they're as bad as they've been at any time since the Second World War, and that's a disgrace in a country like London, a country like Britain, a city like London.
Quick response from you, Luke.
Just to say, like Ken Livingstone's legacy with the congestion charge, Boris with his bikes. What would you like your legacy to be?
He's not even in yet, but I like the question.
Well, let's begin by saying I'd be the first mayor to really take responsibility for safety. The buck stops with me. I'm not going to be a mayor who's going to be blaming central government for cuts, complaining about other people. I'd say I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner and working with these exceptional officers, the Metropolitan Police. We can reduce crime, we must reduce crime, and if I'm mayor, I will.
All right, Luke, thank you for that. Tony in Leytonstone, you're through to Rory Stewart. Go ahead, Tony.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Rory.
Morning, mate. Good morning.
My question to you is, why should we trust you? And the reason for that is that you've been part of a Tory government that since 2010, this country, and or London included, has seen over 700 few libraries, youth club cuts, council budgets slashed. In London only, going to the crime issue that we're discussing today, since 2010, the Met has already made over 700 million pounds in cuts, I think, with a further 325 million required by 2021. The MOJ budget in 2010 cut by 40%.
Okay.
You can talk a good talk, but all we have to go is your record.
All right, and I don't think, stay on the line, Tony, the so-called austerity cuts, you were part of a government that brought those in. You were a senior member of it, actually.
Absolutely. So first thing is, you're absolutely right. We did reduce spending. We had to reduce spending. The government was spending over £100 billion a year more than it was taking in revenue, and there was no way to sustain that. Secondly, you're right that some of those cuts fell in the wrong place. And one of the things that I did, and I want you to really judge me on my record as a minister, what I did in these departments. So when I was in the Ministry of Justice, I acknowledged that we'd cut too many prison officers. We brought back 4,500 more prison officers, put them back on the landings. But the key thing is not the blame game. I could sit here, you can point out that, yes, the Tory government cut. I could also point out that for some reason the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, chose not to spend money on extra police officers himself. But it isn't about the past, it's about the future. And a lot of this is not just about resources. It's about leadership, priorities, energy, action. I reduced violence in prisons by 17% in 7 months after we'd had 5 years of rising violence. So it's that record I want you to judge me on.
Just before I go back to Tony, we know that there are eventually 20,000 extra police officers on their way. It is reported Dame Cressida Dick wants around 6,000. Of course, Mr. Stewart, you'll be aware, that can't be the first 6,000 men and women through the door. There has to be a selection process there. How can we make sure, let's just concern ourselves with the Met, how can we ensure that the Met get the right people, not least as at the other end, of course, people are retiring. So you've got that to counter as well.
That's right. And this was actually the same challenge in some ways that I faced when I was the prisons minister, recruiting more prison officers. It's all very well saying you're going to recruit thousands more. The problem is, where do you find them? Particularly in London and the South East, you're competing in a job market where you can be paid actually more than you can earn as a police constable driving a train. So we need to make sure that we identify the people. Currently at the moment you have about 10 recruits for one place, which means that if you're trying to get 6,000 in, 60,000 would need to apply. And remember, all the other forces in the country are going to be recruiting at the same time. So the solution I found as the prisons minister is to really focus on where the need is in an individual borough. That meant we had to get much smarter with our advertising. We did a lot more on social media. And sometimes you're going to have to be a bit more flexible with a signing up bonus to make sure that you can attract the people in. And then finally, I think it's a big mistake to insist that all police officers in the future should have a university degree. Right? I think that's going to make a huge problem for us. Of course, it's very, very good that some police officers should have a university degree, but it's also very important that police officers should be representative of the communities that they're serving, have the experience, have the common sense that they can bring to that job. And particularly if we want diversity in the police force, I think this is a bad step. And we should continue to be taking a mixture of police officers from different educational backgrounds.
So the RCP, Royal College of Policing, in that instance are wrong when they say you should all have some form of university degree. Just to clarify, Mr. Stewart,
yes.
you want people, as you rightly say, because there are plenty of Londoners out there who didn't even go to sixth form college, let alone get a degree. You want that reflected in the police.
We need a diverse police force. We need a police force where there are people in the police who come from communities, including some of the poorest communities, who understand that. And who, when they're out, I was in the Telsell estate recently watching police officers come onto that estate. It's all the difference in the world between police officers who've grown up. So I was a retired police officer, Clive Driscoll, who began his career patrolling the streets of Brixton. He has family connections in that area. That's very different from insisting now that everybody that comes in has a university degree. And I think that's going to make problems for recruitment, but more than that, it's going to make problems for the type of community policing we need.
And lastly, you've obviously spent a lot of time with them. What makes a good copper, Rory Stewart?
I think a lot of it is about people skills. It's actually in some ways some of the skills that make a really great teacher. It's about knowing when to be strict, when to be compassionate, when to draw the line and set high expectations for people, and when to understand where people are coming from. And above all, I think, as with any job, it's their sense of love of the job, loyalty, energy above all, because it's the energy that makes these great sergeants and police constables take the risks, change their shift times, be flexible to the way that crime's changing in the neighbourhood, take the time out to have the conversations on the streets.
Tony, thank you. Simon's in Orpington. Simon, you're through to Rory Stewart. Go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning, gents. Rory, my question for you. You once described your own constituents in Cumbria as primitive and holding their trousers up with string. Now, when you were running for the Conservative leadership, you met a group of black guys on Brick Lane, and you later described them as minor drug dealers. I don't know what you had to go on to come up with that conclusion. So my question for you is, Rory, is what's your perception, what's your view of Londoners?
OK, well, let me first... I don't want to get in a quibble with this, but you're misquoting me, right? Those are not the words that I used. But I also agree that I have, on 2 occasions in 10 years in politics, caused offence. I apologised immediately. These are not things that I believe about people, and I can understand completely why they
I just have to
cause offence.
clarify.
Yeah.
You did once say some areas around here, this is of the Penrith and Cumbria, are pretty primitive, people holding up their trousers with bits of twine and that sort of thing. Yeah,
Exactly.
For which you have apologised. I give you credit, but we just have to lay that out.
Absolutely.
Rory Stewart.
Absolutely, Nick. And it's important to get the words right and the context in which I said it. But I apologised immediately, and I think politicians need to be pretty careful making jokes. In both cases, I was trying to make a joke, and I caused huge offence.
So what makes a Londoner? Describe or define a Londoner.
Well, firstly, I think you've got to understand London is a collection of 700 villages. So I'm unusual in London because I'm still living in the same house I lived in when I was a small baby. I still go to the same GP that I went to when I was a small baby. That's not normal in London. I walk my son, who's now 5, to the same little school that I was walked to by my father. But the rest of London is very, very mobile, and we're moving between places that are very different. So we need to really think about London as, I think, 700 villages, 700 communities, and creating the links within those communities. That's what deals with mental health issues, with loneliness issues, tapping the volunteering to turn around public services, and understanding that anybody who pretends that they can speak for the whole of London is deluding themselves. This is a city of almost 9 million people. 39% of people in London in the last ONS survey were not even born in the United Kingdom. Right? This is a very, very radical, different London from the London that I was born in. The London that I grew up in as a baby. I actually also was not born in the United Kingdom. My father was serving our country in Hong Kong, and I was born in Hong Kong.
You were born in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Simon, a quick response from you before I move on.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, Rory, you addressed the comments about the Cumbrian constituents. You didn't actually address the comments about the London guys you referred to as minor.
He did say he made 2 comments in his political career which he deeply regretted. He was trying attempts at humour, which he's first to admit did not work. But back to you, Simon.
Okay, I guess, Nick, I mean, can you see, Rory, why, you've left your Cumbrian constituents now, you haven't got a chance of winning this election. Could you see why Londoners might think that you're just using this challenge to keep yourself relevant? It gives you an opportunity to tour, the media stations, but actually you're not going to win it. So why are you here, and are you using Londoners, Rory?
Last polling, but Simon, before you answer, Mr. Stewart, last polling, Sadiq Khan, 45%, Sean Bailey, 23%, Rory Stewart, 13%, Siobhan Benita of the Lib Dems, 8%, but that was in November. Rory Stewart?
Well, the answer is, I very much believe this can be won. I think that people
Hell of a job on your hands, Mr. Stewart.
Hell of a job, but I very much believe this is a winnable race because people care about delivery. People sense that Sadiq Khan has not got a grip on crime. The Conservative candidate, I don't think, has any chance of winning this race. And I think people are ready to take somebody
He's got virtually double your points currently.
Yes, absolutely, but I don't think he has any chance of winning the race.
What does that say of you?
So if you look at for example, the bookies, I'm not saying you want to go on the bookies, I'm well ahead of the Conservative candidate because I think I have the momentum.
Should he drop out? Because you would pick up a lot of votes, I would suggest.
I don't believe that I should push anybody to drop out. I think it's a fair race, and the great thing about this is the largest directly elected election after the President of France in the whole of Europe. Everybody should have a fair choice. But I think there is huge room for independence in politics. I think particularly with local politics, particularly with London. All these big parties are now turning against London. Labour, Conservative, their manifestos, understandably, are focusing on the north of England. How are the Conservatives turning
against London?
Well, if you look at their manifesto, for example, there's mention of small railway stations up in the north of England. No mention at all of Crossrail 2 being taken out of the manifesto entirely. You've got the Financial Secretary of the Treasury, a man who attends the Conservative cabinet, writing in the FT, producing a whole new economic theory about taking investment away from London. And then you've got the Labour candidates, all of whom are competing to be as northern as possible. So we're actually at an era where one of the great advantages as an independent is I can speak for London. I don't have to apologise to my party leader or my manifesto. I can be polite to the central government when I need to, and I can challenge the central government when I need to, but the only thing I need to care about is London.
How would you describe your relationship with Prime Minister Boris Johnson?
I worked with him very closely. I mean, obviously in the end, we disagreed very profoundly, and I resigned from his cabinet, and I left the Conservative Party because I disagreed particularly with a no-deal Brexit. I wanted to stop a no-deal Brexit. But he's somebody I've worked with in the past. He's somebody who was the Mayor of London. He's somebody I believe I could have a very good working relationship with. And I think one of the great things about Boris...
Could you ever be a Conservative Mayor of London?
No, I don't want to be a Conservative.
No, in the future?
No, I very, very much feel that we're moving away from the days of party politics, and there's much more that you can achieve as an independent.
Simon, thank you for your call. Steve in Eaton Bray, which is in Bedfordshire. Steve, your question to Rory Stewart. Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Rory. Rory, I retired from the Metropolitan Police 18 months ago after 32 years. As a CID officer, primarily, I investigated everything from murder to fare evasion. Internationally, with the National Crime Squad, and at a borough level. When I retired, I wanted to stay. The police pension and the terms and conditions made it impossible for me to stay, as in I was offered much better salary to support my family outside the police, and regrettably I left. What are you going to do? Can you do anything to retain my sort of experience? And the only degree I have is from the School of Life.
Well, firstly, to pay tribute to the work that you did, I think you are one of examples, the real heroes that we have in our society. Secondly, you're absolutely right about what you said about the School of Life. But thirdly, the most important point is this one, the point that you make. It's ridiculous that somebody can have that amount of deep experience and want to continue to give back and be unable to do so. So I am absolutely determined that we make it much, much easier to use the skills of police officers, even police officers after they've retired. And there are some simple things we can do on that. Before we get on to full-time salaries, we could start by setting up, and this is something I really want to do, set up a police voluntary reserve where experienced retired police officers, we can produce support for their travel, we can produce a bit of financial support behind them in exchange for them volunteering for a few days a week. That could be directly supporting the police on certain functions. It could also be working with local charities. So that's the first thing. Second thing is...
What about their pensions? Might this not adversely affect their pensions, Mr. Stewart? Isn't that a fear?
Well, at the moment, you can get a re-employment contract which doesn't affect your pension, provided you come in as a third-party contractor.
I see.
If you want to do an enormous amount more of this, you might have to look at the primary legislation. But before you have to do that, there's so much more you could do. If I take an example, I was at Seven Kings just after this horrible triple homicide on Sunday, Monday. And I was talking to the police officers who were manning the tape to prevent the public coming through. There must have been, I guess, about a dozen officers or more just holding the crime scene. That would be, even before we got onto the amazing skills of the caller as a CID officer, the sort of thing that police officers who've retired, who might be prepared to give a day or two a week, could have manned that, freeing up these omnicompetent constables to get out and do their job. The same would be true in a lot of youth services, to bring the experience and the knowledge of police officers to bear. And then there's the final point, which is being made by the CID officer, which is there could be many, many more specialist things that he could do, paid by the police, in addition to the kind of voluntary work that perhaps older police officers might be prepared to do.
Steve, response from what you've heard?
Well, I mean, obviously, you don't stay in a job for 32 years if you don't love it, and I do. Unfortunately, Mr. Stewart, I do have a family to support, so I can't work for free. I was happy to stay. I was asked to look after 10 training new detectives who would all carry about 200 investigations, so I would oversee them. They were going to be paid individually about £35,000. The Metropolitan Police offered me 26.
And that was through a read. That was through
more working privately.
Mr. Stewart's got a question of you.
Was that through one of these Reed third-party contracts?
No, it wasn't. It was something the Metropolitan Police were trying to introduce with a mentoring scheme, but that was the salary I was offered, and I was so disgusted, because the simple fact is the Metropolitan Police, like lots of other employers, know that I'm in receipt of a police pension that I paid for 30 years. I don't think that police pension should be there to supplement a poor salary. I have a skill set. It has a value.
And this is the problem I touched on, Mr. Stewart. That's something you're going to have to address. I know I've had these conversations before. There are many blokes and women just like Steve that they financially they can't afford this.
Absolutely. And I think that there is, for Steve's individual case, there is a question about the primary legislation and the pension. And I agree with you. You would have been taking a very substantial cut in your salary, and you would have been mentoring and training people who were paid more than you. So obviously that model is not working. So I think there are some things that we can do straight away to make more use of retired police officers. But in order to address your situation, we're going to have to look at the law.
Steve, thank you for that. About 25 minutes or so ago, these figures dropped, Mr. Stewart. You won't have had sight of them. Knife crime in England and Wales, and this underscores perhaps the conversation you're having about London, hit a record high in the year ending September. That's up 7% on the previous 12 months. Police recorded offences involving a knife or sharp instrument to some 44,771. Rory Stewart, a comment?
Well, it's completely shocking. I mean, it's not so long ago that those figures would have been 25,000, and we're now up at 44,000. And this is something that can be turned around, and we need the mayor to say, I'm taking responsibility. I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner, and I'm going to provide the leadership and get behind these exceptional people in the Metropolitan Police to reduce crime. John Stevens, who you had on your show earlier today, said the test of a great leader in policing is to say a very simple thing, which is, my job is to reduce crime, and to set about reducing crime. So if I became mayor, I would say very straightforwardly, as I did in prisons, where I said I would resign unless I reduced violent crime in prisons, I would say, I will reduce violent street crime, and we can do it, and we know how to do it, because the police have done it.
But you can't resign as mayor if you don't succeed. So are you saying you wouldn't seek a second term if you failed in your first?
Look, you have to be accountable. I want to hear the mayor say, and I would do this, this is my job, this is what I want you to judge me on. A very simple test. So if you are the mayor, the question...
But what price will you pay if you fail? You can't... Well, you're saying you would resign as mayor? You can't do that. Well, maybe you...
I would be very tempted to resign as mayor. If I thought that I had failed in the fundamental contract that I'd made with the public, I am so confident that this can be done, that we can reduce crime, that we have the resources, we have the plan to do it. I would be prepared to resign if I failed to do it. And the same was true in prisons. If I hadn't reduced violence by 17% in 7 months in prisons, I would have resigned. And that's the kind of leadership you need.
And is Dame Cressida the commissioner who will help you achieve this?
I think she's an exceptional commissioner. But the job of the Police and Crime Commissioner is to set the priorities and the strategies. She's being told to do 200 different things. We need to focus. And what we need to focus on is keeping our streets safe. Streets safe for people to live and work. And somebody needs to work with the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police to say that is your number one priority, and all these additional officers are going into the neighbourhoods to keep the streets safe.
It will probably be some weeks. Lastly, we've just come to our last few moments together before I see you again. Our conversation, the calls have been dominated by crime. If you've been listening and you wanted to talk about air quality, housing, or others, I accept that. What is the next aspect, lastly, in a brief sentence, if you would, Mr. Stewart, that you're now going to turn your focus on?
Next thing is affordable housing. So if you are a teacher or a nurse in the north of England, the average rental price will be about 46% of your salary. If you're living in London, it's about 105% of your salary. London is not livable. We're going to have to provide housing at all different levels. And again, this has not been gripped. There are nearly 200,000 units in London with planning permission that haven't been built out. There are about 100,000 units could be built on Transport for London land. And there is a way to do this, which is to make sure that the government builds out this housing itself, instead of trying to pretend that the private sector is going to deliver affordable housing that it can't afford to deliver.
I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for your time. Apologies again if you try to get on other matters. It has been dominated by crime. I'm done for another day. My thanks to Rory Stewart, independent candidate for this year's mayoral elections. James O'Brien's the other side of the news here on LBC. I'm with you tomorrow morning from 7. Meantime, stay safe.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Not for the first time. One wonders whether Rory Stewart joined the Conservative Party by accident a few years ago.